The second the owner's son strolled into our operations center wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent and throwing around words like innovation, I felt it in my gut. This airline was headed straight for the ground, and no aircraft would even need to leave the runway. I had spent 11 years holding that company together through sheer willpower, terrible coffee, and more sleepless nights than I could count. Meanwhile, people like him drifted through life convinced that a graduate degree and a rehearsed smile made them superior to the men and women actually doing the work. What he fundamentally failed to grasp was this: airlines don't survive on brand image. They survive because exhausted, dedicated people are quietly stopping catastrophes every single hour without anyone ever noticing. My name is Natalie Brooks. For over a decade, I served as the operations lead for a regional airline headquartered in New York. The title sounded impressive at dinner parties, but in reality, it meant I lived inside a freezing room full of monitors, radios, and nonstop urgent calls, wrestling chaos before it could spread coast to coast. While passengers fumed over delayed departures and complained about the snacks, people in my position were rerouting aircraft around severe weather, untangling scheduling nightmares, and making sure pilots didn't hit their legal time limits mid-flight. Everything depended on a platform called Skybridge, an aging piece of software surviving on outdated code and unofficial fixes that only a handful of us truly understood. And among that handful, nobody understood it better than me. Every morning followed the same brutal rhythm: bitter coffee, flickering monitors, and a fresh pile of problems already waiting before the sun came up. That particular Tuesday, I walked in at 4 in the morning and immediately spotted warning alerts blazing across the routing server. A storm system was tearing through the Carolinas. Ground crews in Boston were running behind. Chicago was already stacking up cancellations. My supervisor, Frank, sat hunched over a breakfast sandwich that smelled genuinely awful, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. "Morning, Natalie," he muttered. "It's already brutal out there." I was typing before he even finished the sentence. Within minutes, I had redirected flights around the worst weather, manually patched a server lag threatening to cascade, and reassigned 2 crews who would have timed out before their planes ever touched down. Alert by alert, the warnings disappeared until the screens finally glowed green. That quiet moment always filled me with something I couldn't quite name. Passengers would never learn my name, but hundreds of flights were moving safely because of choices I had made before most of the country finished dreaming. Around 9 that morning, the entire energy of the room shifted the instant those doors swung open. Expensive cologne pushed out the familiar scent of stress and burned coffee. In walked Ethan Mercer, the owner's son, flanked by his fiancée Vanessa, who gripped a tablet like she was personally rescuing the aviation industry. Ethan had spent years wandering through European capitals under the pretense of self-discovery while the rest of us clocked overtime keeping his father's company breathing. Now he had materialized with a shiny executive title and a burning desire to drag the airline into what he called the modern era. "Natalie," he said, flashing the kind of polished smile you can't actually trust. "We're here to observe today. Dad thinks it's time for a fresh set of eyes." Fresh eyes usually means someone upstairs wants to cut experienced people and replace them with software nobody has actually stress tested, I answered. Vanessa let out a small laugh, as if I were being theatrical. She had built a following as a lifestyle influencer before apparently deciding that aviation was her next chapter. 5 minutes into the operations floor, and she was already confidently discussing workflow optimization for systems she clearly had no framework for understanding. At noon, they convened a boardroom meeting, and that was the precise moment I understood we were in serious trouble. Ethan positioned himself in front of an enormous presentation deck and delivered a sweeping speech about artificial intelligence, cutting headcount, and eliminating what he called redundant staffing. Vanessa advanced through slide after slide packed with corporate language while veteran managers sat perfectly still, clearly calculating whether speaking up would cost them their positions. Then Vanessa gestured toward our Milwaukee routes and announced plans to retire the smaller aircraft in favor of larger jets, reducing flight frequency in exchange for what she called operational efficiency. I stared at her, genuinely struggling to respond. Those smaller planes existed for a concrete reason. The secondary airport's runway physically could not accommodate larger aircraft. Beyond that, our core business travelers depended entirely on having multiple daily departure options. Stripping those away would bleed that route dry within a matter of months. I walked through all of it clearly and professionally. Ethan dismissed every word with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never actually been accountable for a broken system. "That's old-fashioned thinking, Natalie," he said. "We need solutions that actually scale." That was when I stopped expecting reason. This was never about improving the airline. It was about proving something to themselves. They resented needing people like me because we were living proof they couldn't actually run things without us. Over the following 2 weeks, the company I had given everything to became almost unrecognizable. Seasoned employees were let go in waves, replaced by automation tools that malfunctioned on arrival. The overnight support team was eliminated entirely because Ethan had decided nothing critical happened after midnight, seemingly unaware that our cargo division ran around the clock and was responsible for millions in revenue. Every concern I raised got filed away and forgotten. Vanessa began shadowing my shifts, peppering me with questions between glances at her phone. "Can't the color-coded display just tell you what's wrong?" she asked one afternoon while I was simultaneously rerouting traffic across 3 airports. "It tells me a flight is delayed," I said. "It doesn't tell me whether I need a maintenance crew or an actual miracle." She told me I needed to work on my attitude. I let that go. That Friday, the calendar invitation from HR appeared with no subject line and no context. I already knew exactly what it meant. Before stepping away from my desk, I quietly completed something I had been preparing for several days. Over the years, I had constructed hundreds of custom scripts that kept Skybridge functioning under pressure. They managed routing recovery, crew scheduling, system backups, and synchronization during outages. Because the company had never formally integrated them, they remained classified as personal workflow tools stored in my secured employee directory. Entirely legal, entirely within policy, and if my credentials were revoked, they would vanish right along with them. At 3 o'clock, I walked into the HR office. Ethan sat beside Vanessa, looking deeply satisfied with himself, while the HR representative studied the table like it contained the answers to everything. Ethan laced his fingers together with theatrical gravity. "Natalie, after evaluating the operational culture, we've determined your approach no longer fits the direction this company is heading." "You mean you're terminating the person responsible for keeping the operation from falling apart?" I said. Vanessa immediately mentioned my negativity and its effect on the workplace. I actually laughed because hearing that after 11 years of missed holidays, fractured relationships, and nights I couldn't remember sleeping through genuinely struck me as absurd. Ethan delivered the final line. I handed back my badge without a word of protest, looked at him, and said quietly, "You think you acquired a machine that runs itself. What you actually did was fire the only person who knew how to operate it." On my way out, I mentioned that the routing cache would refresh at 3:30. He smiled and told me it would be handled. I walked to a bar near the airport, ordered tequila, and pulled up a public flight tracker on my phone. At exactly 3:30, the system refreshed and failed to reconnect to the routing architecture linked to my access credentials. The unraveling began quietly. 1 delayed flight became 5. 5 became 20. Then gate assignments began dropping. Fuel schedules corrupted. Crew records vanished from dispatch entirely. Within an hour, the FAA had issued a ground stop. The airline went completely still. Passengers were stranded at terminals across the country. News broadcasts picked up the story. My phone became unreachable with calls from operations staff desperate for guidance. Ethan called 7 times. Vanessa sent messages telling me people were suffering and that I needed to behave professionally. I blocked them both. Eventually, Richard Mercer himself called. Unlike his son, Richard had genuinely constructed this airline from nothing over decades. He sounded hollowed out. "Natalie, this is a catastrophe," he admitted. "Come back tonight and fix it. Ethan is gone. Vanessa is gone. Tell me what you need." For a moment, I actually considered it. Part of me would always love the controlled madness of operations. But then I thought about every warning dismissed, every smug expression from people who had decided experience was a liability. You let them do this, I said. Now you have to find your way through it. The airline bled millions over the following days. Cancellations cascaded across the country. Investors pulled back. Journalists connected the dots between my termination and the collapse. And across the industry, people suddenly knew exactly who I was. 2 days later, I signed a consulting agreement with a major competitor at nearly 3 times my previous salary. They wanted my expertise, not my compliance. I worked from home rebuilding their infrastructure while watching my former employer dissolve on cable news. A week later, Ethan was removed. 6 months after that, the airline was broken apart and sold off in sections. There are still moments I miss that operations room. The flashing screens, the impossible pressure, the specific satisfaction of solving a crisis before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. But then I come back to the one thing that matters. Companies love to call their people replaceable, right up until the moment they find out exactly what replacing them actually costs.